You are surrounded by organisms that are doing something physicists said was impossible. They are in your garden, on your windowsill, lining the streets you drive through, covering the hillsides you see from your window. They are so common, so ordinary, so unremarkable that you have stopped seeing them. You walk past them every day without a second thought. You mow them, you trim them, you forget to water them and feel mildly guilty about it. They are plants, and they are performing quantum computations that the most advanced laboratories on Earth cannot replicate. This is not metaphor, not poetic license, not the kind of exaggeration that science communicators use to make biology sound more exciting than it is. This is experimental physics, published in Nature, confirmed by multiple independent research groups, awarded some of the most prestigious recognitions in biophysics. You have been taught by school, by culture, by the entire framework of Western thought, since Aristotle, that plants are passive, that they sit in the dirt and absorb sunlight and water and do nothing interesting, that they are the background of life, the scenery, the furniture of the natural world. That consciousness belongs to animals with brains and plants are barely more than sophisticated chemistry. Everything about that is wrong. Plants have at least 20 distinct senses, more than you have. They detect light, gravity, temperature, moisture, touch, vibration, chemical gradients, magnetic fields, electrical signals, and several forms of electromagnetic radiation that you cannot perceive at all. They communicate with each other through chemical signals in the air and electrical signals through their root systems. They share nutrients with their neighbors through underground fungal networks. They warn each other about incoming threats. They recognize their own relatives and treat them differently than strangers. They hear, they learn, they remember, and they do all of this using quantum physics. Plants, organisms without brains, without neurons, without anything resembling a nervous system, are exploiting quantum mechanical effects to do something that classical physics says should not work. They are using quantum coherence, quantum tunneling, quantum superposition, the same phenomena that operate in particle accelerators and superconducting labs at temperatures near absolute zero. Plants are running these processes at room temperature, in wet biological tissue, in the chaotic environment of a living cell. And they have been doing it for 3 billion years, since long before there were physicists to tell them it was impossible. The story begins in 2007 at the University of California, Berkeley. A research group led by Graham Fleming was studying photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into chemical energy, the most fundamental biological process on Earth, the process that feeds virtually every ecosystem, that produces the oxygen you breathe, that sustains the biosphere. The process so basic, so ancient, so well studied that most biologists assumed there was nothing revolutionary left to discover about it. Fleming's group was not looking for a revolution. They were measuring the efficiency of energy transfer in photosynthetic complexes, the molecular machinery inside plant cells that captures photons and converts their energy into chemical form. Specifically, they were studying the Fenner-Matthews-Olson complex, a photosynthetic protein found in green sulfur bacteria, a molecular antenna that captures light and funnels the energy to the reaction center where chemistry happens. The efficiency of this energy transfer was known to be extraordinary, close to 100%. Nearly every photon captured by the antenna complex delivers its energy to the reaction center. Almost no energy is lost. In a world where the best solar panels humans have built convert roughly 20 to 25% of incident light into electricity, photosynthetic organisms achieve near-perfect efficiency. This was known. This was remarkable. But it was not understood. How does the energy get from the antenna to the reaction center so efficiently? The molecular complex is not a wire, not a smooth conduit. It is a tangle of proteins and pigments with multiple possible pathways between the capture point and the reaction center. Some pathways are short, some are long, some are dead ends. If the energy simply hopped randomly from molecule to molecule, the classical picture, it would frequently take wrong turns, get lost in dead ends, waste time and energy finding the right path. The efficiency would be far lower than what is observed. Fleming's group used a technique called two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy, ultrafast laser pulses, that can track energy flow through molecular systems on femtosecond timescales. 1 femtosecond is 1/4,000,000th of a second, a millionth of a billionth, a timescale so short that light itself travels less than a micrometer, and what they found changed biology. The energy does not hop randomly from molecule to molecule. The energy travels as a quantum wave, a coherent quantum superposition that simultaneously explores all possible pathways through the molecular complex at once. The energy does not choose a path. It takes all paths simultaneously. It exists in a superposition of being in multiple places at the same time, exactly like a photon in the double-slit experiment passing through both slits at once. The quantum wave explores every possible route through the complex simultaneously. When it finds the most efficient path, the shortest route with the least energy loss, the wave function collapses onto that path. The energy arrives at the reaction center having taken the optimal route, not by trial and error, not by random hopping, by quantum mechanical exploration of all possibilities at once. This is called quantum walk, the quantum analog of a random walk. In a classical random walk, a particle hops randomly from point to point, eventually finding its destination by chance. Slow, inefficient, wasteful. In a quantum walk, the particle exists as a wave exploring all paths simultaneously. It finds the optimal path not by trying each one, but by trying all of them at once. This is exactly what quantum computers are designed to do. Search through vast numbers of possibilities simultaneously to find optimal solutions. Google, IBM, and dozens of startups are spending billions of dollars trying to build machines that do what a leaf does effortlessly. A leaf, a green, flat, disposable thing that falls from trees in autumn, that you rake into piles and throw away. That piece of biology is running a quantum algorithm more efficiently than any machine humanity has ever constructed. The most advanced quantum computing research in the world is trying to catch up to something that every blade of grass in your lawn has been doing since before the dinosaurs went extinct. Think about that the next time you mow your lawn. You are destroying billions of quantum computers. This is quantum coherence. In a living cell, at room temperature, in a wet, warm, noisy biological environment where every physicist would have predicted quantum effects should be destroyed instantly by thermal noise and molecular vibrations. You need to understand why this shocked physicists. Quantum coherence is fragile, extraordinarily fragile. In laboratory settings, maintaining quantum coherence requires extreme conditions. Temperatures near absolute zero, minus 273 degrees Celsius, perfect vacuum, complete isolation from the environment. Any interaction with the surrounding world, a stray photon, a vibrating molecule, a thermal fluctuation destroys coherence. This is decoherence, the enemy of quantum computation. The reason quantum computers require elaborate cooling systems and shielding and error correction. The inside of a living cell is the opposite of these conditions. Warm, wet, chaotic. Molecules bouncing against each other billions of times per second. Thermal vibrations shaking every bond and every protein. Chemical reactions constantly occurring. Ions flowing. Water molecules tumbling. It is the noisiest, most disruptive environment imaginable for quantum effects. And yet plants maintain quantum coherence long enough for it to matter. Long enough for the quantum wave to explore pathways and find the optimal route. Not for microseconds. for hundreds of femtoseconds. That may sound brief, and it is brief by human standards, but it is vastly longer than physicists predicted. Quantum coherence could survive in biological conditions, long enough to accomplish the task, long enough to explain the near-perfect efficiency. How? How do plants maintain quantum coherence in conditions that should destroy it? The answer, emerging from research over the past 15 years, is even more remarkable than the discovery itself. Plants do not maintain coherence despite the biological noise. They maintain coherence because of it. The thermal vibrations, the very thing that should destroy quantum effects, are tuned to sustain them. The molecular vibrations of the protein scaffold resonate with the quantum oscillations of the energy transfer. The noise is not random. It is structured. It is correlated. It is, for lack of a better word, designed by evolution or by something else to protect and sustain quantum coherence. The protein structure acts as a quantum coherence amplifier. The thermal environment acts as a quantum coherence protector. The biological machinery has evolved to exploit quantum mechanics in ways that human engineers have not yet achieved. 3 billion years of evolution, or 3 billion years of something, produced molecular machines that use quantum physics more efficiently than anything in any laboratory on Earth. This result has been replicated and extended since 2007. Quantum coherence has been found in photosynthetic complexes across dozens of species, in purple bacteria, in marine algae, in higher plants. The phenomenon is not a curiosity limited to one obscure bacterium. It is universal. Every photosynthetic organism on Earth, every organism that converts sunlight into energy, which is virtually every plant and every alga, and every cyanobacterium, appears to use quantum coherence. The most remarkable study came in 2014, when a group at University College London demonstrated quantum coherence in photosynthetic complexes at temperatures up to 150 degrees Celsius, not just room temperature, boiling point and beyond. The quantum effects were not fragile, not delicate, not barely surviving in biological conditions. They were robust, hardened, engineered by billions of years of optimization to function in the harshest environments life encounters. Gregory Engel, one of the original researchers in Fleming's lab, summarized the finding in a way that captures its significance. Biology has been doing quantum computing for billions of years. We're just late to the party. Late does not begin to describe it. We have not even entered the building. Photosynthesis was the first discovery. It was not the last. In 2008, researchers at the University of Manchester demonstrated that enzymes, the molecular catalysts that drive virtually every chemical reaction in living organisms, use quantum tunneling. Tunneling is the quantum mechanical phenomenon where a particle passes through an energy barrier that it classically cannot overcome, like a ball rolling toward a hill too steep to climb and appearing on the other side without going over the top. In classical physics, this is impossible. In quantum mechanics, it is routine. Enzymes catalyze reactions millions of times faster than the same reactions would occur without them. This speed has always been attributed to classical mechanisms. The enzyme holds the reactant molecules in the right orientation, lowers the energy barrier, stabilizes the transition state. Standard biochemistry, standard explanations. But the Manchester group showed that hydrogen atoms in enzyme reactions tunnel through energy barriers rather than going over them. The tunneling is not a minor correction. It is essential to the reaction rate. Without quantum tunneling, many enzymatic reactions would be too slow to sustain life. This means something about you. Right now, your metabolism, the sum of all chemical reactions in your body, depends on quantum tunneling. The enzymes breaking down the food in your stomach, the enzymes producing energy in your mitochondria, the enzymes replicating your DNA, the enzymes synthesizing the proteins that make up your muscles, your organs, your brain. All of them use quantum tunneling. All of them depend on particles doing something that classical physics says cannot happen. You are alive because of quantum mechanics. Not in the vague sense that all chemistry is ultimately quantum. In the specific, operational, experimentally confirmed sense that quantum tunneling is a required mechanism in the biochemistry that sustains your life. Remove quantum tunneling from your enzymes and the reactions slow by factors of thousands. Your metabolism halts. You die. Not eventually. Immediately. You are a quantum machine. You just did not know it. And so is every plant, every animal, every bacterium, every living thing on Earth. Since then, quantum effects have been found throughout biology. In the navigation systems of migratory birds, European robins detect the Earth's magnetic field through quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins in their eyes. 2 electrons in a cryptochrome molecule become entangled. The Earth's magnetic field, which is incredibly weak, roughly 100 times weaker than a refrigerator magnet, alters the quantum state of the entangled pair. The bird's visual system detects this alteration. The robin literally sees the magnetic field, not as a compass needle, as a quantum interference pattern overlaid on its vision. A bird navigating from Scandinavia to North Africa is using quantum entanglement to find its way. A phenomenon Einstein called spooky action at a distance guides a bird across continents. In olfaction, there is growing evidence that smell operates not by molecular shape alone, but by quantum vibrations. The traditional lock and key model says receptors in your nose detect molecules by their shape. But molecules with identical shapes, but different quantum vibrational frequencies, smell different. And molecules with different shapes but similar vibrational frequencies smell the same. Luca Turin proposed in 1996 that olfactory receptors detect quantum vibrations through electron tunneling. Your nose might be a quantum sensor detecting the vibrational frequency of molecules through quantum tunneling. In DNA mutation, proton tunneling across hydrogen bonds in DNA base pairs may be a significant source of genetic mutations. Evolution itself may be driven partly by quantum effects. And in plants specifically, the discoveries keep coming, not just in photosynthesis, in how plants detect gravity, in how they process light signals, in how they communicate chemically with neighboring plants, in how they respond to sound. Yes, sound. In 2012, researchers at the University of Western Australia published a study showing that plant roots grow toward the sound of running water, not toward moisture gradients, not toward chemical signals from water, toward the sound, the vibrations, the acoustic waves produced by water flowing through pipes. Monica Gagliano, the lead researcher, placed pea plants in containers where they could grow in 2 directions. One direction led toward a source of recorded water sounds. The other led toward actual moisture. The roots grew toward the sound, consistently, reproducibly. The plants could detect acoustic vibrations and grow toward them. In 2014, Gagliano published another study showing that plants can learn. Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant that folds its leaves when touched, was repeatedly dropped from a short height. At first, the plants folded their leaves on each drop. After several repetitions, they stopped folding. They had learned that the drop was not dangerous. They habituated. This is not a simple chemical reflex. Habituation requires some form of memory, some way of storing information about past events and modifying future behavior based on that stored information. The plants remembered the learning for weeks. When tested again 28 days later, they still did not fold their leaves in response to the drop, but they still folded in response to new stimuli, a touch, a puff of air. They had not lost sensitivity. They had learned to distinguish between a harmless stimulus and a potentially dangerous one. Without a brain, without neurons, without synapses, without any structure that neuroscience says is required for learning and memory. Where is the memory stored? In what medium? Through what mechanism? If a plant can learn and remember without neurons, then neurons are not required for learning and memory. Then the assumption that consciousness and intelligence require brains, the assumption that underlies all of neuroscience, all of cognitive science, all of artificial intelligence is wrong, not challenged, not questioned, wrong, demonstrated to be wrong by a plant that remembers being dropped. In 2019, a study from Tel Aviv University demonstrated that flowers can hear bees. Evening primrose flowers, when exposed to the sound of bee wing beats or recordings of similar frequencies, increased the sugar concentration in their nectar within 3 minutes. 3 minutes, not 3 days, not 3 hours, 3 minutes. The flowers detected the sound, processed it, and responded with a specific biochemical change designed to attract the pollinator. The mechanism is elegant. The bowl-shaped petals act as acoustic receivers vibrating in response to specific frequencies, like a satellite dish tuned to a particular signal. The vibration triggers a cascade of biochemical responses that increase nectar sweetness. The flowers ignore irrelevant sounds, wind, traffic, human speech. They respond specifically to the frequencies of their pollinators. They are listening, selectively, for the right sound, and responding with purpose. The study was titled "Flowers Respond to Pollinator Sound Within Minutes by Increasing Nectar Sugar Concentration." Published in Ecology Letters, peer-reviewed, replicated. The senior author, Lilach Hadani, said, "We were quite surprised. Plants have been considered unable to hear. We showed that they can. Not just that they can, that they do, routinely, as part of their normal biology. Every evening, primrose in every field is listening for bees. Every moment, waiting, responding, sweetening its nectar when it hears the right frequency. A flower, listening for a specific sound and answering. Plants detect sound, respond to sound, learn from experience, remember what they have learned, communicate with other plants through chemical signals, share resources with neighboring plants through underground fungal networks, respond to gravity, light, temperature, humidity, touch, and electromagnetic fields, all without a brain, all without neurons, all without anything resembling a nervous system. And here is where the quantum biology becomes profound. How does an organism without a nervous system process information? How does it learn? How does it make decisions? And plants do make decisions, choosing where to grow roots, when to flower, how to allocate resources between growth and defense. Classical biology says it is all chemistry, hormones, signal molecules, gene expression, feedback loops, no mystery, no consciousness, no awareness, just molecular machinery operating according to chemical rules. But classical chemistry cannot explain the efficiency of photosynthetic energy transfer, cannot fully explain the speed of enzymatic catalysis, cannot account for the navigational precision of migratory birds. Classical biology without quantum mechanics is incomplete. What if quantum effects in plants are not limited to photosynthesis and enzyme catalysis? What if quantum coherence, the ability to explore multiple possibilities simultaneously, operates more broadly in plant biology, in information processing, in decision-making, in the integration of multiple environmental signals into coherent behavioral responses? What if the reason plants can do all the things they do here, learn, remember, communicate, make decisions, respond to 20 different environmental signals simultaneously, is that they are processing information quantum mechanically, not through the slow, sequential, one-step-at-a-time processing of classical chemistry, through the parallel, simultaneous, all paths at once processing of quantum coherence? A classical computer processes one calculation at a time. A quantum computer processes many simultaneously. A brain processes information through electrochemical signals in neural networks. A plant might process information through quantum effects in molecular networks. Different hardware, different mechanism. Same result, intelligent behavior. Appropriate responses to environmental challenges. Survival. Adaptation. Success. 3 billion years of success. Every ecosystem on Earth dominated by plants. Every land surface covered by them. Every food chain beginning with them. Every breath of oxygen produced by them. If plant intelligence is real, and the evidence increasingly says it is, then it is the most successful form of intelligence on the planet. More successful than animal intelligence. More successful than human intelligence. Plants have been here longer, occupy more biomass, and dominate more ecosystems than any animal that has ever lived. This is speculative. This is the frontier. But it is a frontier built on solid experimental ground. Quantum coherence in photosynthesis is confirmed. Quantum tunneling in enzymes is confirmed. Quantum entanglement in bird navigation is confirmed. The question is not whether quantum effects operate in biology. The question is how far they extend. And if they extend to information processing, if plants are using quantum computations to process environmental data and make decisions, then the boundary between alive and aware becomes far less clear than classical biology assumed. A plant that uses quantum coherence to explore multiple pathways simultaneously is doing something structurally identical to what a quantum computer does. It is processing information. It is computing. It is at the molecular level performing operations that in any other context we would call intelligent. Not intelligent in the way you are intelligent, not conscious in the way you are conscious, but something. Something more than dead chemistry following blind rules. Something that uses the deepest features of physics: superposition, coherence, tunneling, possibly entanglement, to interact with its environment in ways that are far more sophisticated than anyone suspected until 2007. Jesus said, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow." Matthew 6:28. 2,000 years later, physicists considered them and found quantum mechanics. He did not say study the stars, did not say examine the atoms, did not say look through telescopes at distant galaxies. He said consider the lilies, the flowers, the plants, the quiet, overlooked, taken for granted organisms that grow in fields and are cut down and thrown into ovens. Consider them. Look at them closely. Pay attention to what they are doing. 2,000 years later, we finally paid attention, and what we found shattered the assumption that plants are simple, that life without brains is life without intelligence, that organisms without nervous systems cannot process information or make decisions or respond to their environment with sophistication. The lilies are doing something extraordinary. They are running quantum computations, hearing sound, learning from experience, communicating with their neighbors, making decisions about resource allocation, detecting gravity and light and temperature and touch and electromagnetic fields and the wing beats of approaching pollinators. And this is only part one. Because the question that matters is not what plants can do. The question that matters is what it means. If plants are intelligent without brains, if they process information through quantum effects, if they learn and remember without neurons, then what is intelligence? What is consciousness? And where does it come from? The answer, or the beginning of the answer, lies underground. In the networks that connect plants to each other, in the communication systems that make a forest not a collection of individual trees, but a single interconnected organism. In the wood wide web, that is where we go next. Beneath your feet, right now, there is a network. Not a metaphorical network, not a poetic description of roots tangled in soil, an actual functioning information transmitting network that connects individual organisms into a collective system. A network through which resources are shared, warnings are sent, information is exchanged, and the weak are supported by the strong. A network so vast, so complex, so sophisticated that when scientists finally mapped it, they compared it to the internet. They called it the Wood Wide Web. And it has been operating for roughly 400 million years, since before the first animal walked on land, since before the first dinosaur, since before flowers existed, since before the continents had their current shapes. This network predates every human technology, every human civilization, every human being by hundreds of millions of years. You are standing on top of a communication system older than brains, older than nervous systems, older than eyes, older than any sensory organ that any animal has ever possessed. The first internet was not built by humans, it was built by fungi, and plants have been using it since before animal life figured out how to crawl. The network is made of mycorrhizal fungi, thread-like fungal filaments hyphae that grow through soil and attach to the roots of plants. The connection is intimate. The fungal hyphae penetrate the root cells of the plant, intertwining with them at the cellular level. Neither organism is parasitizing the other. This is mutualism, symbiosis, cooperation. The plant provides the fungus with sugars produced by photosynthesis, the quantum mechanical process we discussed in part 1. The fungus provides the plant with water and minerals, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, that its vast underground network can access from far larger soil volumes than the plant's roots alone could reach. This much was known for decades. Standard mycology, standard botany. What was not known, what was not even suspected until the 1990s, was that the fungal network does not just connect individual plants to the soil, it connects plants to each other. Suzanne Simard discovered this, and the story of her discovery is one of the great scientific narratives of the last 50 years. Simard grew up in the forests of British Columbia. Her family had been loggers for generations. She knew forests the way most people know their neighborhoods, intimately, physically, from childhood. She became a forestry researcher, and in the early 1990s, she noticed something that the logging industry's models could not explain. Clear-cut areas that were replanted with a single species, usually Douglas fir, the commercially valuable species, performed poorly. The seedlings struggled, grew slowly, got sick, died at high rates. The forestry models said this should not happen. The seedlings had plenty of light, plenty of space, no competition from other species. They should have thrived. They did not. Simard suspected the problem was what the clear-cutting had removed. Not just the trees, the network, the underground connections between species, the fungal web that linked the old-growth forest into a single system. She designed an experiment. She planted Douglas fir and paper birch seedlings in a forest and covered them with plastic bags. Then she injected radioactive carbon dioxide into the bags, covering the birch trees. If the birch trees absorbed the radioactive carbon through photosynthesis, and if that carbon then appeared in the Douglas fir trees that were not exposed to the radioactive gas, it would prove that carbon was traveling between species through the underground network. The carbon appeared in the fir trees within hours, not trace amounts, significant amounts. The birch was sending carbon to the fir through the mycorrhizal network, sharing resources, feeding its neighbor, not through the air, not through root contact, through the fungal internet. Simard published the results in Nature in 1997. The paper was titled Net Transfer of Carbon Between Ectomycorrhizal Tree Species in the Field. Dry, technical. The kind of title that makes non-scientists glaze over. But the implications were explosive, because the finding contradicted the foundational assumption of ecology since Darwin. Competition, survival of the fittest, the idea that individual organisms compete for resources and the strongest survive and the weakest perish, and this brutal arithmetic drives evolution forward. Trees were not competing. Trees were cooperating, sharing, helping each other survive, not occasionally, not accidentally, systematically, continuously, through an infrastructure specifically maintained for the purpose of resource sharing. The forestry establishment pushed back hard. Simard was a young woman in a male-dominated field, challenging the economic models that justified industrial logging practices. If forests are interconnected systems that depend on fungal networks, then clear-cutting which destroys the network is not just removing trees. It is dismantling a 400-million-year-old communication and resource-sharing system. It is disconnecting the internet and expecting the economy to keep functioning. Simard persisted. She spent the next 25 years producing experiment after experiment, each one revealing another layer of the network's complexity, and each one making the forestry industry more uncomfortable. But that was not the most remarkable finding. Simard discovered that the transfer was not random. It was directional. It was responsive. It changed based on need. In summer, when the birch trees had full canopy exposure to sunlight and were producing abundant sugars, carbon flowed from birch to fir. The birch was sharing its surplus with the fir, which was shaded and struggling. In autumn, when the birch lost its leaves and could no longer photosynthesize, the flow reversed. Carbon flowed from fir to birch. The evergreen fir, still photosynthesizing through winter, was supporting the deciduous birch through its leafless months. The trees were helping each other, sharing resources based on who needed them most, adjusting the flow seasonally, responding to changing conditions, not through conscious decision, or at least not through anything we would recognize as conscious decision, through the network, through the fungal web that connected them, through a system of resource sharing so sophisticated that economists would recognize it as a functioning economy. Simard's discoveries deepened over the following decades. She found that the network has structure. It is not a uniform web of equal connections. It has hubs, nodes, central trees that are connected to hundreds of other trees through the fungal network. She called these hub trees mother trees. A mother tree is typically the oldest, largest tree in a stand. It is connected to hundreds of other trees of multiple species through the mycorrhizal network. It sends carbon and nutrients to seedlings, particularly its own offspring. It can recognize its own kin. Simard showed that mother trees send more carbon to their own seedlings than to unrelated seedlings of the same species. They recognize family, and they preferentially support family. When a mother tree is dying, when it is injured, diseased, approaching the end of its life, it does something that should stop you in your tracks. It dumps its resources into the network, sends massive pulses of carbon and nutrients to surrounding trees, particularly to its offspring. It does not hoard, does not conserve, does not withdraw. It gives everything away. A final act of generosity. A dying tree feeding the next generation through the underground network it spent its lifetime building and maintaining. Simard described it as a legacy. The mother tree's last act is to ensure the survival of its community, to transfer its accumulated resources, decades or centuries of stored carbon to the trees that will continue after it is gone. Think about this. A tree that has lived for 300 years, that has survived storms and droughts and fires and disease, that has built connections to hundreds of other trees through centuries of slow fungal growth. That tree, when it senses its own death approaching, through disease, through injury, through the accumulated damage of centuries, makes a decision. It does not fight to survive. It does not hoard its remaining resources for one last desperate attempt at recovery. It gives, massively, generously, completely. It floods the network with everything it has left: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, defense compounds, information. A 300-year-old organism choosing generosity over self-preservation, without a brain, without consciousness as we define it, without anything that should be capable of making such a choice, or perhaps with exactly the kind of consciousness that makes such a choice natural, perhaps with a form of awareness so different from ours that we cannot recognize it, perhaps with an intelligence that operates at timescales of centuries rather than seconds, that processes information through millions of root tips rather than billions of neurons, that experiences the world through chemical signals and fungal connections rather than eyes and ears. This is not chemistry operating blindly. This is behavior, directed, purposeful, responsive behavior. A tree recognizing its own kin, adjusting resource distribution based on need, responding to seasonal changes, making a final resource transfer when dying, all without a brain, all without neurons, all through a fungal network that processes information in ways we do not fully understand. The network does more than share food, it shares information. In 1983, Jack Schultz and Ian Baldwin at Dartmouth College demonstrated that when trees are attacked by insects, neighboring trees increase their chemical defenses before the insects reach them. The unattacked trees somehow know that an attack is coming. They prepare. They produce defensive chemicals, tannins, phenolics, protease inhibitors that make their leaves less palatable or toxic to the incoming herbivores. The initial assumption was that the warning traveled through the air. Volatile chemical signals, compounds released by the damaged tree that drift on the wind to neighboring trees. This is true. Airborne signals are part of the communication system, but they are not the only part. The fungal network also carries warning signals. When a tree is attacked by insects or infected by a pathogen, it sends chemical signals through the mycorrhizal network to connected trees. The receiving trees activate their defense genes and begin producing defensive compounds before they are attacked. The warning travels underground, through the fungal hyphae, from tree to tree, across the network. The speed is remarkable. The defense response in neighboring trees begins within hours of the initial attack. Not days, not weeks, hours. The network transmits information quickly enough for the receiving trees to mount effective defenses before the threat arrives. And the specificity is extraordinary. The warning signals are not generic alarms. They contain information about the type of threat. Trees attacked by bark beetles send different signals than trees attacked by caterpillars. The receiving trees activate defenses specific to the incoming threat. They do not just prepare, they prepare for the right enemy. The network transmits not just the fact of an attack, but the identity of the attacker. Some trees go further. When attacked by caterpillars, certain species release volatile chemicals that attract the specific predators of those caterpillars: parasitic wasps, predatory beetles. The tree under attack is calling for help, recruiting mercenaries, sending a chemical distress signal that brings in air support against the invading army, and the signal is specific enough that the right predator shows up for the right pest. Acacia trees in Africa produce tannins when giraffes begin eating their leaves. The tannins make the leaves bitter and mildly toxic. But the tree also releases ethylene gas, a warning signal that drifts downwind to neighboring acacias. The downwind trees begin producing tannins before the giraffe reaches them. The giraffe, arriving at the next tree, finds the leaves already bitter. Experienced giraffes have learned to walk upwind when feeding against the direction of the chemical warning to find trees that have not yet received the signal. The trees evolved a communication system. The giraffes evolved a counter-strategy. The trees and giraffes have been engaged in an arms race of chemical warfare and behavioral adaptation for millions of years. Each side innovating, each side responding to the other's innovations, each side demonstrating intelligence, one with a brain, one without. This is an immune system operating at the level of a forest, not at the level of individual trees. The network connects individual immune responses into a collective defense. An attack on one tree triggers defensive responses across the entire connected community. The forest defends itself as a unit, as an organism, as a single connected system, rather than a collection of isolated individuals. Stefano Mancuso has spent his career arguing that this is exactly what forests are, not collections of individual trees, superorganisms. Mancuso is a professor at the University of Florence and the founder of the International Laboratory of Plant Neurobiology. The name is deliberately provocative. Plants do not have neurons. Mancuso knows this. He uses neurobiology to make a point. That information processing, signal transmission, and coordinated response, the functions that neurons perform in animals occur in plants through different mechanisms, but with comparable sophistication. Mancuso's research has demonstrated that plant root tips function as information processing centers. Each root tip continuously senses its environment, detecting gravity, moisture, nutrients, toxic substances, obstacles, and the root tips of other plants. Each root tip makes decisions about growth direction based on the integration of these multiple signals. And each root tip communicates with other root tips on the same plant through electrical signals that travel through the root system. The electrical signals are real, measured, recorded. They travel at speeds of up to 1 centimeter per second through the root network. Slow by animal. Nervous system standards, nerve impulses, travel at up to 120 meters per second. But fast enough for a plant. Fast enough for an organism that makes decisions on timescales of minutes and hours rather than milliseconds. The signals are not random electrical noise. They carry information. When a root tip encounters an obstacle, it sends an electrical signal that causes other root tips to change direction. When a root tip finds a nutrient-rich patch of soil, it signals other roots to grow toward the same area. When a root tip detects a toxic substance, it warns the network, and the plant reallocates growth away from the contaminated zone. Mancuso has recorded action potential-like signals in plant roots that are structurally similar to the action potentials in animal neurons. Not identical, but similar enough that the comparison is not metaphor. It is structural homology, different evolutionary origins, same functional outcome, different chemistry, same physics. A single plant can have millions of root tips, each one sensing, each one deciding, each one communicating with the others. The root system operates as a distributed information processing network, millions of nodes, each contributing local information to a collective decision about how the plant should grow. Mancuso compares this to the internet, not metaphorically, structurally. The internet is a distributed network with no central control. Information is processed locally at individual nodes and shared across the network. Decisions emerge from the collective behavior of millions of interacting nodes, not from a central authority. Plant root systems work the same way. No central brain, no command center, no single organ directing behavior. Instead, millions of root tips, each processing local information and sharing it with the network. The plant's behavior, its decisions about growth, defense, reproduction, resource allocation, emerges from the collective processing of millions of distributed nodes. This is not how animals work. Animal intelligence is centralized. The brain receives information from sensory organs, processes it, and sends commands to muscles and glands. There is a center, a controller, a boss. Plant intelligence, if it is intelligence, is decentralized, distributed, networked. There is no center, no controller, no boss. There is only the network. And the network, through the collective behavior of its millions of nodes, produces behavior that is indistinguishable from intelligent behavior. Growth toward resources, avoidance of threats, defense against attackers, cooperation with allies, support for offspring, communication with neighbors. Charles Darwin saw this. In 1880, in his last book, The Power of Movement in Plants, Darwin wrote that the root tip acts like the brain of one of the lower animals. He was ridiculed for the comparison. Botanists dismissed it as an old man's sentimentality. Plants do not have brains. The comparison was inappropriate, unscientific, anthropomorphic. 140 years later, Mancuso is making the same comparison, with experimental evidence that Darwin did not have, with neurobiological frameworks that Darwin could not have imagined, with quantum biology that Darwin never dreamed of. And the comparison holds, not because root tips are brains, because root tips perform the same functions as brains through different mechanisms: information processing, signal integration, decision-making, memory, learning. Different hardware, same software, different mechanisms, same results. Now scale this up. From individual plants to forests, from root systems to the wood wide web, a single tree has millions of root tips, each processing information and communicating with the others. That tree is connected through mycorrhizal fungi to hundreds of other trees. Each of those trees has millions of root tips. Each is processing information. Each is communicating through the network. A single hectare of forest soil can contain hundreds of kilometers of mycorrhizal hyphae. Hundreds of kilometers in 1 hectare. To put this in perspective, a hectare is about the size of 2 football fields. And beneath those 2 football fields, there are enough fungal threads to stretch from New York to Philadelphia, or from London to Paris, in every hectare, in every forest, on every continent. The network is not sparse, it is dense, thick, pervasive. Every cubic centimeter of forest soil is threaded with fungal filaments connecting roots to roots, trees to trees, species to species. A single teaspoon of healthy forest soil contains more fungal hyphae than there are stars in the Milky Way. The network beneath your feet is more complex than the visible forest above it. And the network is old. The oldest mycorrhizal fossils date to roughly 450 million years ago, the Ordovician period. When plants first colonized land, they did not do it alone. They did it with fungi. The partnership between plants and mycorrhizal fungi is not a recent innovation. It is foundational. It is how land plants have survived since the beginning. The network was there first. The trees grew into it, not the other way around. The total network in a mature forest connects every tree to every other tree, not through one pathway, through multiple redundant pathways. If one connection is broken, a root dies, a fungal strand is severed, the network reroutes. Like the internet, it is resilient, designed to maintain connectivity even when individual nodes or connections fail. The architecture is robust. The topology is optimized for reliability, and the amount of information flowing through this network is staggering. Chemical signals, nutrient transfers, defensive warnings, kin recognition signals, hormonal cues, electrical impulses, water, minerals, sugars. The network carries everything the forest needs to function as a coordinated system. Peter Wohlleben, a German forester, wrote The Hidden Life of Trees, based on decades of observation and emerging research. The book became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions. Because the story it tells is not just about trees, it is about everything we thought we knew about nature being wrong. Wohlleben describes forests as communities, societies, families, Trees that care for their sick neighbouring trees pump sugars into the roots of diseased individuals, supporting them through illness the way a family brings soup to a bedridden relative. Trees that feed their young mother trees channel disproportionate resources to seedlings through the network, nursing them through the vulnerable years when they are too small to capture enough light on their own. Trees that mourn their dead stumps of felled trees kept alive for decades by neighbouring trees that continue to pump sugars into the stump through the network. A dead tree that is not allowed to die because its community will not let it. Wolleben found stumps in German forests that had been alive for over 400 years after being cut down. 400 years. No leaves, no photosynthesis, no way to produce energy. Sustained entirely by the network, by the trees around them pumping sugars into a stump that could give nothing back. For 4 centuries. Why? What possible evolutionary advantage does keeping a dead stump alive provide? The standard Darwinian answer, selfish genes, individual fitness, cost-benefit analysis, cannot explain it. The cost to the surrounding trees is real. The benefit to the stump is zero. It cannot reproduce, cannot photosynthesize, cannot contribute to the network. It is dead weight, literally. Unless the unit of survival is not the individual tree, unless the unit of survival is the network, the forest, the community. Unless trees are not individual organisms competing for resources, but nodes in a collective organism that maintains its members the way your body maintains its cells, not because each cell independently deserves to survive, but because the whole depends on the health of its parts. Is this intelligence? Is a forest that shares resources, sends warnings, recognizes kin, supports the weak, maintains redundant communication networks, and keeps its dead alive? Is that intelligent? If an alien species visited Earth and observed a system that processes information through millions of distributed nodes, communicates through a vast underground network, shares resources based on need, defends itself collectively against threats, and maintains its members even after individual failure, would that alien call it intelligent? Or would the alien only call it intelligent if the nodes were made of neurons? This is not a hypothetical question. It is a bias question. It asks whether our definition of intelligence is objective, describing a real property of nature, or anthropocentric, describing a property of human brains that we have mistakenly assumed to be the only form intelligence can take. Every definition of intelligence that neuroscience has ever proposed: information processing, adaptive behavior, learning, memory, communication, decision-making, resource optimization is satisfied by the Wood Wide Web. Everyone. The forest meets every functional criterion for intelligence. It fails only one criterion: it does not have a brain. But must have a brain is not a criterion for intelligence. It is a criterion for being an animal. We have confused the two. We have looked at the one form of intelligence we know best, our own, and declared it the only form that counts. We have defined intelligence in terms of our own hardware, and then concluded that nothing with different hardware can be intelligent. This is like defining flight as moving through air using feathered wings, and then concluding that bats cannot fly. The definition excludes by design. The exclusion tells you about the definition, not about reality. The answer to that question determines everything about how you understand consciousness, about how you understand life, about how you understand the universe. If intelligence requires neurons, if consciousness requires brains, then plants are automatons. Sophisticated chemical machines operating according to predetermined rules. The resource sharing is chemistry. The communication is chemistry. The kin recognition is chemistry. The dying mother tree dumping its resources into the network is chemistry. Beautiful, complex, remarkable chemistry. But just chemistry. No awareness. No experience. No inner life. If intelligence does not require neurons, if consciousness can emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system, then plants are something else entirely. Something that challenges every assumption Western science has made about the nature of mind. Something that suggests consciousness is not a product of brains but a property of information processing. Something that implies awareness might be far more widespread in nature than anyone imagined. Not human awareness, not animal awareness, something different, something we do not have words for. Something that experiences the world through 20 senses, processes information through millions of distributed nodes, communicates through an underground network spanning hectares, and has been doing all of this for 400 million years. Something that was here long before we were, that will be here long after we are gone, that has been quietly, patiently, silently processing information and responding to the world since before the first brain evolved, since before the first neuron fired, since before the first animal opened its first eye. And here is what should keep you awake at night. If plants can process information without neurons, what is information processing? If plants can make decisions without brains, what is decision making? If plants can learn and remember without synapses, what are learning and memory? If plants can communicate without language, what is communication? Every one of these capabilities was supposed to require a nervous system. Every one was supposed to be a product of neural computation. Every one was supposed to be impossible without the specific biological hardware neurons, synapses, axons, dendrites, that animals evolved roughly 600 million years ago. Plants have been doing all of it for 400 million years, without any of that hardware, using different mechanisms, different chemistry, different physics, possibly quantum physics, which means the functions are not tied to the hardware. The information processing is not a product of neurons. It is a product of something more fundamental, something that neurons do well and fungal networks do differently, and quantum coherent molecular systems do in yet another way, something that transcends the specific biological machinery, something that might be a fundamental property of nature rather than an emergent property of brains. The question is not whether plants are intelligent. The evidence says they are by any functional definition of intelligence. The question is what that intelligence means, what it implies about the nature of consciousness, what it tells us about the universe that produced it. And that question, the question of consciousness without brains, of awareness without neurons, of intelligence without the biological machinery that Western science has always assumed was required, is the most profound question in all of science. And it is the question we take up in part 3, where we ask, if plants can think without brains, what is consciousness? Where does it come from? And is it possible that consciousness is not produced by matter at all, but that matter is produced by consciousness? The answer might be hidden in the roots. There is a question that science has been avoiding for 400 years. Avoiding not because it is unimportant, but because it is unanswerable. Not because it is vague, but because it is too precise. Not because nobody cares, but because everyone who has tried to answer it has failed. The question is this: what is consciousness? Not intelligence, not information processing, not adaptive behavior, not any of the functional properties that plants demonstrably possess. Consciousness, the subjective experience of being something. The inner life, the felt quality of existence, the fact that there is something it is like to be you, that you do not merely process information, but experience the processing. That you do not merely detect light but see colors, that you do not merely register damage but feel pain, that you are not merely a biological machine executing programs but a being who is aware of being a being. This is the hard problem of consciousness. Named by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995 but recognized implicitly by thinkers for millennia, The hard problem is not explaining what consciousness does. We can study its functions, its neural correlates, its behavioral effects. The hard problem is explaining why consciousness exists at all. Why is there subjective experience? Why does it feel like something to be alive? Why are we not philosophical zombies, beings that process information and respond to stimuli and exhibit complex behavior but experience nothing? Beings that function identically to us but have no inner life. No theory in neuroscience answers this. No theory in physics answers this. No theory in any discipline answers this. The hard problem remains unsolved, and plants have just made it harder. Here is why. The standard assumption in neuroscience is that consciousness is produced by brains, specifically by neurons, specifically by the complex patterns of electrochemical activity in networks of billions of neurons connected by trillions of synapses. Consciousness is what neurons do when they are wired together in sufficiently complex ways. More complexity, more consciousness. No neurons, no consciousness. The brain produces consciousness the way the liver produces bile as a biological function of a specific organ. This is called the materialist or physicalist view of consciousness, and it has dominated science for over a century. It is the default assumption of every neuroscience textbook, every psychology department, every medical school, every artificial intelligence lab. Consciousness equals brain activity, period. Plants have no brains, no neurons, no synapses, no electrochemical neural networks. By the materialist account, plants cannot be conscious, cannot experience anything, cannot have an inner life. And they are biological machines. Sophisticated, yes. Impressive, certainly. But machines, without awareness, without experience, without the lights being on inside. But plants do things that, in any animal, we would attribute to consciousness. They learn, they remember, they make decisions, they communicate, they recognize kin, they share resources based on need, they defend their communities collectively, they sacrifice individual resources for the good of the network. They hear sounds and respond with specific biochemical changes within minutes. If a dog learned a new behavior, remembered it for weeks, made decisions based on environmental signals, recognized its relatives, shared food with family members, and responded to specific sounds, we would not hesitate to attribute consciousness to the dog. We would say, the dog is aware, the dog experiences its world, the dog has an inner life. When a plant does the same things, we say it is just chemistry. Why? Because the plant does not have a brain. That is the only reason. Not because the behavior is different. Not because the functional capabilities are different. Not because the complexity is different. Only because the hardware is different. We attribute consciousness to one system because it uses neurons. We deny consciousness to another system because it uses different mechanisms. Even though both systems produce the same functional outcomes, this is not science. This is prejudice. Neurochauvinism, as philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith calls it. The unexamined assumption that neurons are the only substrate capable of generating consciousness. An assumption that has never been proven. An assumption that plant biology is now challenging at its foundations. There is an alternative that has been gaining ground in philosophy and physics for the past 2 decades. An alternative that plant consciousness makes suddenly urgent. Panpsychism. The word sounds mystical. It is not. Panpsychism is the philosophical position that consciousness is not produced by brains. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. Like mass, like charge, like spin, every physical system has some form of consciousness, not human consciousness, not animal consciousness, but some basic form of experience, some rudimentary inner life, some minimal subjective quality. An electron does not think, A rock does not feel emotions. A photon does not contemplate its existence. Panpsychism does not claim this. What panpsychism claims is that the basic building blocks of reality have some minimal experiential quality, some proto-consciousness, some flicker of subjectivity that becomes richer and more complex as systems become more organized and more integrated. Human consciousness is what proto-consciousness looks like when it is organized into 100 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses. Plant consciousness is what proto-consciousness looks like when it is organized into millions of root tips connected by a fungal network spanning hectares. Different organization, different complexity, different experience, but the same fundamental property expressed through different structures. This is not fringe philosophy. Panpsychism is defended by some of the most respected minds in contemporary philosophy and physics. Philip Goff at Durham University, Galen Strawson at the University of Texas, David Chalmers himself, the man who defined the hard problem, considers panpsychism a serious contender for solving it. Christoph Koch, former president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science, one of the most prominent neuroscientists alive, has argued for a form of panpsychism based on integrated information theory. The argument for panpsychism is not mystical, it is logical. It goes like this: consciousness exists. This is undeniable. You are experiencing something right now. Descartes was right about this. The one thing you cannot doubt is that you are conscious. Consciousness is associated with physical systems, specifically with brains. Damage the brain and consciousness changes. Alter brain chemistry and experience changes. The correlation between brain states and conscious states is tight and well documented. Now, either consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter at some point of complexity, or consciousness was there all along in some form. If consciousness emerges, if there is a threshold of complexity above which experience appears and below which there is nothing, then there must be a moment in the organization of matter where the lights turn on, where the universe goes from containing no experience to containing experience, where something arises from nothing. No one can explain this transition. No one can even begin to explain it. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? How does the felt quality of seeing red emerge from the electrochemical activity of neurons? How does the warmth of love emerge from neurotransmitter release? How does the sting of grief emerge from synaptic patterns? How does something experience come from nothing non-experience? This is not a gap in our knowledge. This is not a problem that better brain scans or more powerful computers will solve. This is a conceptual chasm. There is no bridge from the objective to the subjective. From the third-person description of neural activity to the first-person reality of experience, you can describe every neuron firing in a brain experiencing red. Map every synapse. Track every neurotransmitter molecule, and you will have a complete physical description that says nothing about what red looks like, about what it feels like to see it, about the qualitative character of the experience. The philosopher Thomas Nagel captured this in his famous 1974 paper, What is it like to be a bat? We can know everything about bat neuroscience, echolocation, sonar processing, spatial mapping, and we will still not know what it is like to be a bat, what it feels like to experience sonar, what the subjective quality of echolocation is. The objective facts do not deliver the subjective reality, no matter how complete they are. This is the hard problem, and it is hard precisely because the emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter is inexplicable. There is no mechanism, no theory, no even remotely plausible account of how it could happen. Panpsychism dissolves the hard problem by denying the premise. Consciousness does not emerge from non-conscious matter because matter was never non-conscious. The basic constituents of reality have always had some experiential quality. Consciousness does not appear at a threshold. It was always there. What changes with complexity is not whether consciousness exists, but how rich it is, how integrated, how structured, how much of the universe it encompasses. Giulio Tononi has formalized this intuition into a mathematical theory. Integrated Information Theory, IIT, is the most rigorous attempt to build a science of consciousness from first principles. Tononi starts with what we know about consciousness from the inside, from our own experience. Consciousness is integrated. Your visual field, your thoughts, your emotions, your body sensations are all bound together into a single unified experience. You do not experience colors separately from shapes, separately from sounds. Everything is woven into one seamless field of awareness. And consciousness is differentiated. The number of possible states of your experience is astronomically large. Every moment of consciousness is unique. You never have exactly the same experience twice. The space of possible experiences is vast beyond calculation. From these two properties, integration and differentiation, Tononi derives a mathematical measure of consciousness called phi. Phi measures the amount of integrated information in a system. How much information the system generates above and beyond what its individual parts generate independently. How much the whole exceeds the sum of its parts. A system with high phi is highly conscious. A system with low phi is minimally conscious. A system with zero phi, a system where the parts are independent and the whole adds nothing beyond the sum, has no consciousness. Your brain has extremely high phi. The 100 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others, integrated into a system where every part is influenced by every other part. This produces enormous integrated information. Enormous phi. Rich, vivid, detailed consciousness. A thermostat has essentially zero phi. Its parts are independent. The mercury expands independently of the switch. The switch operates independently of the heater. There is no integration. No whole greater than the sum of parts. No consciousness. What about a computer? A standard digital computer, despite processing enormous amounts of information, has relatively low phi. Because its transistors operate in feed-forward chains, information flows one direction. The parts are not deeply interconnected. The architecture is modular, not integrated. IIT predicts controversially that digital computers are not conscious. No matter how intelligent they appear, no matter how well they simulate human conversation, if the architecture lacks deep integration, phi is low, and consciousness is absent. This is a profound and counterintuitive prediction. A machine that passes the Turing test might not be conscious. A plant that fails the Turing test might be. Because what matters for consciousness is not computational power, not speed, not the ability to produce human-like outputs. What matters is integration. The degree to which every part of the system is influenced by every other part. The degree to which the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And by this measure, biological networks, including plant networks, might be more conscious than computers, because biological networks are deeply integrated. Every root tip influences every other root tip. Every tree in a forest influences every other tree through the fungal web. The integration is total. The phi is non-trivial. But here is what matters for our story. IIT does not require neurons. IIT does not require brains. IIT does not require carbon-based biology. IIT says consciousness is a property of any system with integrated information, any system with non-zero phi, regardless of what it is made of, regardless of its substrate, regardless of whether it is biological or digital or mineral or fungal. A plant root network, millions of root tips, each processing information, each communicating with the others through electrical and chemical signals, the whole integrated through the mycorrhizal web into a system where every part influences every other part. Such a system has non-zero, phi, has integrated information, has, according to IIT, some form of consciousness. Not human consciousness, not rich, vivid, detailed consciousness, but something, some minimal experience, some rudimentary awareness, some flicker of what it is like to be that network, to sense the soil, to detect moisture and nutrients, to feel the pull of gravity, to hear the sound of water, to respond to the vibrations of bee wings. IIT says this flicker is real, not metaphorical, not projected by human imagination, real as your consciousness, different in degree, not different in kind. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff propose something even more radical. Their orchestrated objective reduction theory, Orch-OR, argues that consciousness arises from quantum computations in microtubules inside neurons. Microtubules are tiny protein structures inside cells that serve as scaffolding, transport systems, and according to Penrose and Hameroff quantum computers, the theory was widely dismissed when it was proposed in the 1990s. The biological environment is too warm and wet for quantum effects. Decoherence would destroy quantum states instantly. Quantum computation in the brain is impossible. Then 2007 happened. Fleming discovered quantum coherence in photosynthesis, in warm, wet, biological conditions, the exact conditions that physicists said would prevent quantum effects. Plants proved that quantum coherence can survive in biology. The argument against Orch-OR that quantum effects cannot operate in biological systems was destroyed by a leaf. Penrose and Hameroff noticed, and they noticed something else. Microtubules are found in every eukaryotic cell, not just neurons, every cell. Plant cells have microtubules. Fungal cells have microtubules. Every cell in every organism on Earth has the same protein structures that Orch-OR says are the substrate of consciousness. If Orch-OR is correct, if consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules, then consciousness is not a property of brains. It is a property of cells. Every cell has microtubules. Every cell is capable of some form of quantum computation. Every cell has some form of consciousness. This reframes biology entirely. The single-celled organism, the bacterium, the amoeba, the paramecium, is not an unconscious automaton. It is a conscious being, a minimal one, a barely flickering one, but a conscious one. And the evolution of multicellular life was not the evolution of consciousness from non-consciousness. It was the evolution of complex consciousness from simple consciousness. The integration of billions of individually conscious cells into a collective awareness greater than any individual cell could achieve alone. Your brain is not the origin of your consciousness. Your brain is the integration of the consciousness of 86 billion individual cells into a unified field of experience. Each neuron contributes its own microtubular quantum computation. The whole, the integrated network, produces the rich, vivid awareness you experience as you. A plant with trillions of cells, each containing microtubules, all connected through electrical and chemical and fungal networks, would have not just rudimentary consciousness but a rich, complex, distributed form of awareness, not centralized like animal consciousness, distributed, networked, decentralized, but real and potentially vast. The theory is unproven, the evidence is circumstantial, but the logic is consistent, and the discovery of quantum biology in plants has removed the strongest objection. There is another way to think about consciousness and brains, a way that flips the materialist assumption on its head. The materialist says the brain produces consciousness. Consciousness is a product of neural activity. No brain, no consciousness. The brain is the factory, consciousness is the product. But what if the brain does not produce consciousness? What if the brain filters consciousness? This is the filter theory, proposed by William James in the 19th century, elaborated by Aldous Huxley, defended today by philosophers like Edward Kelly at the University of Virginia. The analogy is a television set. A television does not produce the broadcast. It receives the broadcast and converts it into images and sound. If you damage the television, the images degrade. If you destroy the television, the images disappear. But the broadcast continues. The broadcast exists independently of the television. The television is a receiver, not a source. The filter theory says the brain is like the television. It does not produce consciousness. It receives consciousness, or channels it, or filters it, or focuses it from a broader field of awareness into the narrow beam of individual human experience. Damage the brain, and consciousness narrows. Alter the brain and consciousness changes. Destroy the brain and the filter theory says consciousness does not end. It returns to the broader field from which it was filtered. Evidence for the filter theory comes from several unexpected directions. Terminal lucidity. Patients with severe dementia, patients who have not spoken coherently in years, whose brains are measurably devastated by Alzheimer's disease, sometimes become suddenly completely lucid in the hours or days before death. They recognize family members, carry on coherent conversations, display personality traits that had been absent for years. Their brains have not healed. The neural tissue is still destroyed. The materialist model says this should be impossible. If consciousness is produced by the brain and the brain is destroyed, consciousness should not return. But it does. Briefly, inexplicably, luminously. Near-death experiences. We have covered these in earlier series. Patients who are clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, flat EEG, report vivid, structured, coherent experiences. Experiences that occur during periods when the brain is not functioning. The materialist model says no brain activity means no experience. The data says otherwise. Psychedelic research, psilocybin, LSD, and DMT produce among the most vivid, meaningful, and consciousness-expanding experiences humans report. People under the influence of psilocybin describe dissolving boundaries between self and world, experiencing unity with nature, feeling the aliveness of trees and rivers and mountains, reporting that plants and animals possess a luminous awareness they had previously been blind to. The materialist assumption would predict that these experiences correspond to increased brain activity. More consciousness should require more neural firing. More vivid experience should mean more intense neural computation. The brain should be working harder to produce these extraordinary states. But fMRI studies show the opposite. Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London demonstrated in 2012 that psilocybin decreases brain activity. Specifically, it decreases activity in the default mode network, the brain region associated with the sense of self, with ego, with the narrative I that normally dominates your experience. The most profound expansions of consciousness correlate with reductions in neural activity. Less brain activity produces more consciousness. Less filtering produces more awareness. The filter is being opened. The brain is doing less, and consciousness is experiencing more, as if removing a constraint allows something already present to flow more freely, as if the brain is normally restricting consciousness to a narrow beam and the psychedelic widens the aperture. People who return from these experiences consistently report that nature is alive, that trees are conscious, that the boundary between human awareness and plant awareness is thinner than they thought, that the aliveness they perceived was not a hallucination but a revelation, the temporary removal of a filter that normally blinds them to what is really there. Is this evidence? Not in the scientific sense, but it is consistent with the filter theory. And it is remarkably consistent with what every indigenous tradition and every mystical tradition has said about the consciousness of nature for thousands of years. If the filter theory is correct, then plant consciousness becomes not just possible, but expected. If consciousness is not produced by brains but filtered through them, then any physical system capable of interacting with consciousness, capable of receiving it, channeling it, focusing it, could be conscious. The brain is one kind of filter. A plant root network could be another. A fungal web could be another. The ocean could be another. The universe itself could be another. Consciousness everywhere. Not because it is produced everywhere, because it is received everywhere. Because it is the fundamental medium in which all physical systems exist. And different systems filter it differently: brains into human experience, plants into plant experience, fungi into fungal experience, perhaps rocks into something so minimal it barely registers. Now, connect this to quantum mechanics, because the connection changes everything. Part 1 showed that plants use quantum coherence, that photosynthesis operates through quantum superposition energy, exploring all paths simultaneously, finding the optimal route through the molecular complex. That enzymes use quantum tunneling particles passing through barriers that classical physics says are impassable. That biological systems exploit quantum mechanics in ways that physicists said were impossible and that human technology cannot replicate. Part 2 showed that plants process information through distributed networks that span hectares, that forests are collective organisms connected by fungal webs older than brains. That intelligence operates without neurons, without centralization, without any of the hardware that Western science assumed was required. That a tree dying in a forest makes a decision to give away everything it has to the community that sustained it. Now Part 3 asks, is this intelligence conscious? Is there something it is like to be a tree, to be a forest, to be a network of roots and fungi stretching through the dark soil, sensing and responding and communicating and deciding? And the answer depends on what consciousness is. If consciousness is a product of neurons, plants are not conscious. Case closed. But this position is increasingly difficult to defend, because plants do everything that conscious animals do: learn, remember, communicate, decide, cooperate, sacrifice. The only thing they lack is the specific hardware we assumed was necessary, and the assumption was never proven. It was inherited from Descartes, who declared animals were machines, from the Enlightenment, which declared matter was dead, from the scientific revolution, which declared consciousness was a late-arriving property of sufficiently complex brains. If consciousness is integrated information IIT, then plants are conscious. Their networks have non-zero phi. Their systems integrate information. The theory predicts consciousness wherever integration exists. If consciousness is quantum computation in microtubules Orch-OR, then plants are conscious. Their cells contain microtubules. Their biology supports quantum coherence. The substrate is present. If consciousness is fundamental panpsychism, then plants are conscious. Everything is conscious. Plants are conscious the way everything is conscious, but more so, because their systems are more complex and more integrated than rocks or rivers. If consciousness is filtered rather than produced, then plants receive consciousness through their biological structures, the way brains receive consciousness through neurons. Different filter, different experience, same source. Every major theory of consciousness, except the one that assumes without evidence that neurons are the only possible substrate, predicts that plants are conscious. And here is where the silence gets loud. Science does not know what consciousness is. After 400 years of modern science, after 200 years of neuroscience, after decades of brain imaging and neural recording and computational modeling and philosophical analysis, after the combined effort of thousands of brilliant minds, after billions of dollars of research funding, We do not know what consciousness is, do not know where it comes from, do not know why it exists, do not know whether it is produced or received or fundamental or emergent. We are conscious beings, studying consciousness. We are the phenomenon trying to explain itself, and we have failed, not partially, completely. We have not moved 1 inch closer to solving the hard problem since Chalmers named it in 1995, since Descartes identified it in 1641, since the Upanishads explored it 3,000 years ago. The most intimate fact of your existence, the fact that you experience anything at all, is the one fact that science cannot explain, the one fact that lies beyond every equation, beyond every brain scan, beyond every theory. You know you are conscious with more certainty than you know anything else, and you have no idea why. We do not even know how to study it properly. Every method we have, brain scans, behavioral tests, neural recordings, studies the correlates of consciousness, not consciousness itself. We measure what the brain does when someone is conscious. We do not measure consciousness directly. We cannot. We have no instrument for detecting subjective experience, no consciousness meter, no awareness detector. We infer consciousness from behavior and from self-report, and neither behavior nor self-report is available from plants. So we default to the assumption that plants are not conscious, not because we have evidence that they are not, because we have no way to know whether they are. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence. The inability to detect plant consciousness becomes proof that plant consciousness does not exist. The limitations of our instruments become limitations of reality. This is not science. This is the argument from ignorance dressed in a lab coat. What we know is this: plants process information, plants make decisions, plants learn and remember, plants communicate and cooperate. Plants use quantum mechanics in ways that human technology cannot replicate. Plants are connected through networks more ancient, more vast, and more resilient than any network humans have ever built. Whether the lights are on inside, whether there is something it is like to be a tree in a forest connected to hundreds of other trees through an underground web, sensing the soil and the light and the wind and the approach of predators and the vibrations of pollinators, we do not know, cannot know, not yet, perhaps not ever. But the traditions knew, or believed they knew, or intuited something that science is only now beginning to take seriously. And that is where we go in part 4, to the oldest knowledge, to the text that said the heavens and the earth and everything in them is alive, is aware, is praising, is conscious, not because they had fMRI machines, because they had something else, something that looked at a lily in a field and saw not a biological machine but a living being participating in the same consciousness that moves through everything, something that stood in a forest and felt the trees watching, something that placed a hand on bark and sensed a presence, something that the scientific revolution told us was superstition and the quantum revolution is suggesting might have been perception. The oldest human intuition that nature is alive, that trees have spirits, that rivers have souls, that the earth itself is aware might not be animism, might not be primitive mythology, might not be the projection of human consciousness onto unconscious matter. It might be accurate, including you. For 3 parts, we have let science speak. We have followed the experiments, the data, the mathematics, the peer-reviewed publications, and science has told us something extraordinary. Plants run quantum computations more efficiently than any human technology. They hear sounds and respond within minutes. They learn from experience and remember what they learned for weeks. They process information through distributed networks of millions of root tips. They communicate through underground fungal webs that span entire forests. They share resources based on need. They recognize their own kin. They warn their neighbors of incoming threats. They sacrifice their own resources for their communities when they are dying. And the most rigorous theories of consciousness integrated information theory, Panpsychism, Orch-OR, filter theory predict that plants are not merely processing information but experiencing something, that there is something it is like to be a tree in a forest, that the lights are on inside. That consciousness does not require neurons and might not require brains and might be a fundamental property of reality rather than a product of biological machinery. Science arrived at these conclusions in the last 2 decades, through experiments that shattered assumptions, through mathematics that challenged paradigms, through discoveries that forced the most conservative discipline in human culture to consider the possibility that nature is alive in ways we never imagined. The traditions arrived at the same conclusions thousands of years ago. Start with Christianity, because this is where the story begins for the largest religious community on earth. And because the Christian scriptures say something about the consciousness of nature that most Christians have either forgotten or never noticed. Paul writes to the Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 22, "For the creation waits in eager expectation for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time." Read that carefully. Paul does not say creation is a backdrop, does not say nature is a stage on which the human drama plays out, does not say plants and animals and rocks and rivers are unconscious matter arranged for human convenience. He says, creation waits, creation hopes, creation groans, creation experiences frustration, creation anticipates liberation. These are not the words of a man describing unconscious matter. These are the words of a man describing a conscious universe, a universe that feels, that suffers, that hopes, that waits for something, that experiences its condition and longs for something better. Paul is attributing consciousness to creation, not to individual animals or plants specifically, to creation as a whole, to the entirety of the natural world. The Greek word he uses, kthesis, means the whole created order, everything that exists, the universe itself. And he says it groans, it waits, it hopes. The Psalms are even more explicit. Psalm 96-12. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Not a metaphor for human emotions projected onto nature, a command. Let the trees sing. The psalmist is addressing the trees directly, telling them to express joy, assuming they can, assuming they have something inside that is capable of joy. Psalm 98-8. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Rivers clapping, mountains singing. Not in human language, not with human organs. In their own way, through their own form of expression, through whatever medium a river or a mountain uses to participate in the celebration of existence. Psalm 148 is the most remarkable. It is a cosmic hymn of praise in which every element of creation is called to worship. Sun and moon, stars, highest heavens, waters above the skies, sea creatures and ocean depths, lightning and hail, snow and clouds, stormy winds, mountains and hills, fruit trees and cedars, wild animals and cattle, small creatures and flying birds. Everything, every element of the natural world, called to praise, not metaphorically, liturgically, as participants in a cosmic act of worship. The psalmist does not say, "Let the trees remind us to praise God." The psalmist says, "Let the trees praise God," directly, in their own voice, through their own form of consciousness. Francis of Assisi understood this. In the 13th century, he composed the Canticle of the Sun, one of the earliest works of Italian literature and one of the most radical theological statements in Christian history. He addressed the sun as Brother Sunday, the moon as Sister Moon, the wind, water, fire, and earth as siblings, not as resources, not as property, not as objects for human use, as family, as fellow beings, as conscious participants in a shared creation. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with coloured flowers and herbs. Earth governs, Earth produces, Earth sustains, not as a machine executing a program, as a sister, as a mother, as a conscious agent whose actions are expressions of being, not mechanical outputs of a system. Francis preached to birds. The story is famous. At Bivagna, he stopped on a road, saw a large flock of birds in the trees and on the ground, and began speaking to them. My sisters, the birds, you owe much to God your Creator, and you must always and everywhere praise Him. The birds, according to the account, did not fly away. They stayed. They listened. They stretched their necks and extended their wings and opened their beaks and looked at him. He was not performing, not making a theological point through theatre. He was communicating because he believed the birds could hear, because he believed they were conscious beings capable of receiving a message, because he believed the boundary between human consciousness and animal consciousness and plant consciousness was thinner than the theology of his era acknowledged, because he had perceived something that his culture had been trained to ignore, that nature is alive, that it listens, that it responds, that it is present in a way that goes beyond biochemistry. The Church declared him a saint, and in 1979, Pope John Paul II declared Francis the patron saint of ecology, not despite his belief in the consciousness of nature, because of the wholeness of his vision, because he saw creation as Christianity's own scriptures describe it: alive, aware, groaning, hoping, praising, singing. This vision was largely lost during the scientific revolution. Descartes declared animals to be machines automata, without souls, without consciousness, without inner life. The screams of a tortured dog, Descartes argued, are no different from the squeaking of a machine. Just mechanical responses, no experience, no suffering, no awareness. Descartes' view became the default of Western science, and it extended beyond animals to all of nature. Plants are machines, ecosystems are machines, the universe is a machine. Consciousness is a late arriving property of sufficiently complex brains. Everything else is dead matter following blind laws. The consequences were catastrophic. If nature is a machine, you can take it apart without moral concern. If forests are collections of unconscious timber, you can clear-cut them without guilt. If rivers are unconscious water channels, you can dam them and divert them and pollute them without ethical consequence. If animals are automata, you can cage them and experiment on them and slaughter them and feel nothing because they feel nothing. The ecological crisis, the mass extinction, the climate disruption, the deforestation, the ocean acidification, the collapse of insect populations is not merely a technological problem, it is a perceptual problem. It is the direct consequence of believing that nature is dead, that plants are machines, that consciousness belongs to humans alone. When you treat conscious beings as unconscious matter, destruction follows, not as accident but as logic. If nothing out there is aware, nothing out there can be harmed. But what if the premise was wrong? What if nature is not dead? What if the trees do sing? What if the earth does groan? What if the mountains do prostrate? What if 400 million years of quantum computing, network-connected, community-sustaining intelligence has been watching us destroy it and groaning, just as Paul said, waiting for liberation? The ecological crisis is a crisis of perception, and the cure might not be better technology. The cure might be better perception, seeing what Francis saw, hearing what Solomon heard, understanding what the psalmist understood. But this was never the view of the scriptures, never the view of the Psalms, never the view of Paul, never the view of Francis. The Christian tradition in its own texts, in its own saints, in its own liturgy, describes a conscious creation, a creation that praises, that groans, that waits, that hopes, that sings. Quantum biology did not discover plant consciousness. Quantum biology rediscovered what the Psalms have been saying for 3,000 years. Islam is even more explicit. Surah Al-Isra, 1744. The seven heavens and the earth and whatever is in them exalt him, and there is not a thing except that it exalts by his praise, but you do not understand their way of praising. Read the last clause again. But you do not understand their way of praising. The Quran does not say that the praise of nature is metaphorical, does not say it is a poetic way of describing natural processes, does not say humans project consciousness onto unconscious matter. The Quran says nature praises God, actually, literally, in a way that humans do not understand. The limitation is not in nature. The limitation is in human perception. Nature is conscious and expressive. Humans are simply unable to perceive the form that consciousness takes in non-human beings. This is precisely what science is now discovering. Plants communicate, plants respond, plants process information, plants make decisions. They do all of this in ways that humans could not detect until 2007, until we had femtosecond lasers and two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy and underground isotope tracking and acoustic vibration analysis. The instruments revealed what was always there, the consciousness of nature, praising in ways we did not understand until now. Surah An-Nur 24-41. Do you not see that God is exalted by whoever is within the heavens and the earth, and by the birds with wings spread? Each one has known his own prayer and his own exaltation. Each one has known its own prayer, not a collective, undifferentiated hum of unconscious matter, vibrating in response to physical laws. Each individual being, each bird, each tree, each river, each mountain has its own specific form of praise, its own prayer, its own way of connecting to the divine. Individualized consciousness, specific awareness, personal experience. The Quran goes further. Surah An-Naml 27-18. An ant speaks, warns its colony about the approaching army of Solomon. The Quran attributes language and awareness and social concern to an ant, not metaphorically, narratively, as part of the story of a prophet who was given the ability to understand the languages of animals and insects. Solomon, in the Quranic account, is not granted a supernatural power. He is granted a perceptual ability, the ability to understand what was always being said. The ants were always communicating. The birds were always speaking. The trees were always praising. Solomon was simply given ears to hear what human ears normally cannot. This is the filter theory stated in 7th century Arabic. Human perception is limited. Nature's consciousness exceeds what humans can detect. The limitation is in the filter, not in the reality. And in Surah Ar-Rahman 55-6, and the stars and trees prostrate. The Arabic word used yasjudan is the same word used for human prostration in prayer. The same physical act, the same spiritual meaning. Stars and trees do not merely exist. They worship, they prostrate, they submit to the same reality that humans are called to submit to. The difference is not in the act, the difference is in the form. Hinduism places the consciousness of nature at the very center of its metaphysics. The Upanishads teach that Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of being, the source of everything, is present in all things, not hovering above creation, not separate from creation, in creation as creation. The Chandogya Upanishad says, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. All this is Brahman. Not all this was created by Brahman. All this is Brahman. The tree is Brahman. The river is Brahman. The soil is Brahman. The fungal network is Brahman. You are Brahman. Everything is one consciousness expressing itself through infinite forms. The Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, verses 20 through 39. Krishna declares himself present in every category of existence. I am the self seated in the hearts of all beings, not the hearts of all humans, all beings, all creatures, all living things. The self-consciousness, awareness, the inner light is present in everything, in the lion and the eagle and the banyan tree and the Ganges river and the wind and the moon. Hindu practice reflects this. The Tulsi plant, holy basil, is not merely a useful herb, it is worshipped, treated as a living deity. Families in India keep Tulsi plants in their courtyards and perform daily devotions to them, not to the idea the plant represents, to the plant itself. As a conscious being worthy of reverence, as a form through which the divine is directly present and accessible. The banyan tree is sacred. The peepal tree, the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment, is sacred. Trees in Hinduism are not resources. They are temples. Living temples housing conscious divine presence. The tradition does not distinguish between the consciousness in a human and the consciousness in a tree. It says the same consciousness, Brahman, Atman, the self, is present in both. Different forms, different expressions. Same source, same nature, same awareness. Buddhism takes a different approach, but arrives at a structurally similar place. The Buddhist concept of sentient beings, sattva in Sanskrit, includes all beings capable of suffering. The exact boundary of sentience has been debated within Buddhism for millennia. Do plants suffer? Do they have Buddha nature? Can they achieve enlightenment? The Mahayana tradition generally says yes. The Lotus Sutra suggests that Buddha nature pervades all phenomena, not just animals, not just humans, but grass and trees and rivers and mountains. The Japanese Buddhist teacher Chihai wrote in the 6th century that even grasses and trees, lands and mountains, all have Buddha nature. This became a central teaching in Tendai and later in Zen Buddhism. Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen, in 13th century Japan, wrote extensively about the sentience of the natural world. His essay, Mountains and Waters Sutra, is one of the most radical philosophical texts in any tradition. Mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. Not a symbol of the Buddha way. The actualization. Mountains and waters are themselves awakened, themselves conscious, themselves expressing the same reality that human practitioners seek through meditation. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the eon of emptiness, they are alive at this moment. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation realization. Mountains have a self. Waters have realization. The natural world is not striving toward enlightenment. It has already achieved it. It has always been enlightened. The trees do not need to meditate. The rivers do not need to practice. They are already what the monk is trying to become. Already awake, already present, already free. This is perhaps the most humbling claim in any tradition, that the tree outside your window is more enlightened than you are, that the forest has already achieved what you are still seeking, that the plants are not below you on some hierarchy of consciousness, but alongside you, perhaps ahead of you on the path that every conscious being walks. In practical terms, this means that a Zen garden is not a representation of enlightenment. It is enlightenment. The rocks are aware. The moss is aware. The raked gravel is aware. The garden does not point to consciousness. The garden is consciousness. Every grain of sand participating in the same awareness that the meditating monk is trying to access. The Buddhist precept of non-harm ahimsa originally applied primarily to animals, but in many traditions it extends to plants. Jain monks sweep the ground before them to avoid stepping on insects. Some traditions extend this care to plants, avoiding unnecessary harm to living vegetation, because it too possesses some form of sentience, some form of awareness, some form of experience that deserves moral consideration. Judaism grounds the consciousness of nature in the structure of creation itself. The first chapter of Genesis describes creation in a specific sequence. God creates, God speaks, and then repeatedly, emphatically, God declares creation good. And God saw that it was good, not useful, not functional, not adequate for human purposes. Good, tov, a moral and aesthetic judgment, an evaluation that implies the thing being evaluated has value in itself. Not instrumental value, value for human use. Intrinsic value, value, because of what it is. When God creates the plants on the third day, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees. The vegetation is declared good before humans exist. Before any creature exists to use it, the plants have value independent of any observer, any consumer, any beneficiary. They are good in themselves. Their existence matters. Their being is praiseworthy. The Jewish mystical tradition Kabbalah teaches that divine sparks are hidden in all matter, in every rock, every drop of water, every leaf, every grain of soil. The sparks are fragments of divine light consciousness, awareness, divine presence scattered throughout creation during the primordial act of Tzimtzum. Every physical object contains a spark of consciousness. The human task is tikkun olam, repairing the world by recognizing and elevating these sparks, by treating every element of creation as containing something sacred, something aware, something divine. The Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees, is a celebration of the consciousness and dignity of the plant kingdom. Trees have their own new year, their own cycle of renewal, their own place in the sacred calendar. They are not background, they are participants, members of the created community with their own holidays, their own seasons, their own relationship with the divine. Indigenous traditions, worldwide traditions that Western science dismissed as primitive animism, have been saying this, the longest and the loudest. Aboriginal Australians speak of the dream time, an eternal present in which the consciousness of the land is active, aware and communicating. The land is not dead matter, the land is alive. The rocks remember, the rivers speak, the trees are ancestors. The entire landscape is a conscious being with which humans have a relationship of reciprocity and responsibility. Native American traditions speak of plants as plant people, not metaphorically, relationally. The corn is a person, the tobacco is a person, the cedar is a person. Each plant has its own spirit, its own awareness, its own personality, its own preferences. Indigenous agriculture was not the exploitation of unconscious resources. It was a relationship between conscious beings, human people and plant people, governed by protocols of respect, gratitude, and reciprocity. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, writes in Braiding Sweetgrass about the intersection of indigenous knowledge and Western science. The book became a phenomenon. Millions of copies sold, translated into dozens of languages, read by scientists and non-scientists alike, because it offers something that neither science nor religion alone provides. A way of knowing that is both rigorous and relational, both observational and participatory, both analytical and reverent. Chimera describes the Potawatomi language as encoding a fundamentally different relationship with nature than English does. In Potawatomi, a bay is not an it, a bay is a who. The grammar itself treats natural entities as beings rather than objects. You do not say the bay is beautiful the way you would say the table is beautiful. You say it the way you would say she is beautiful. The language does not allow you to reduce nature to an object. The grammar is a moral framework. It forces you to relate to the natural world as a community of conscious beings rather than a warehouse of resources. She describes the indigenous understanding of plants as teachers, as healers, as conscious partners in the project of sustaining life on Earth. And she notes, with quiet precision, that Western science is only now discovering what indigenous peoples have known for millennia, that plants communicate, cooperate, share resources, and respond to their environment with sophisticated intelligence. The plants have been teaching us all along, she writes. We just forgot how to listen. The indigenous traditions were not primitive. They were perceptive. They detected through direct experience, through intimate relationship with the natural world, through thousands of years of careful observation, the same properties that 21st century science is now confirming, with femtosecond lasers and isotope tracking and quantum spectroscopy, now the synthesis. The part where everything connects. Every tradition, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, indigenous traditions worldwide, describes nature as conscious, as alive, as aware, as praising, worshipping, communicating, experiencing. Each tradition uses different language, different frameworks, different theological structures. But the claim is universal. The natural world is not dead matter. It is alive with consciousness. And the human inability to perceive this consciousness is a limitation of human perception, not a limitation of nature. Science, specifically quantum biology, plant neurobiology, and consciousness theory, is now providing evidence that supports this claim. Not proves it, supports it. The evidence is provisional. The theories are incomplete. The conclusions are tentative. But the direction is unmistakable. Plants use quantum mechanics. Plants process information. Plants learn and remember. Plants communicate and cooperate. Plants exhibit every functional hallmark of consciousness. And the leading theories of consciousness, IIT, Panpsychism, Orch-OR, filter theory, predict that plants are indeed conscious. That there is something it is like to be a tree. That the lights are on inside. The convergence between ancient traditions and modern science is not proof that either is correct. It is evidence that both are investigating the same reality, and that reality has a structure that reveals itself to anyone who pays close enough attention, whether they are paying attention with a femtosecond laser or with a prayer. Now, the honest part, the part that matters most. We do not know if plants are conscious. We do not have a consciousness detector. We cannot measure subjective experience. We cannot prove that there is something it is like to be a tree any more than we can prove there is something it is like to be your neighbor. We infer consciousness from behavior and from structural similarity to systems we believe are conscious. And these inferences, for plants, are strong but not conclusive. We do not know if quantum effects play a role in plant cognition beyond photosynthesis and enzyme catalysis. The extension of quantum biology from molecular energy transfer to whole organism information processing is speculative, promising, grounded in confirmed discoveries, but speculative. We do not know if the parallels between religious descriptions of nature's consciousness and scientific discoveries of plant intelligence are meaningful or coincidental. Humans are pattern seekers. We find connections where none exist. We see faces in clouds. We hear messages in random noise. Perhaps the convergence between traditions and science is another case of pattern seeking, another projection of meaning onto data that has none. We do not know if the ecological implications are real. Perhaps treating nature as conscious would change human behavior. Perhaps it would not. Perhaps the crisis of perception argument is itself a romantic projection, a desire for a simpler, more connected relationship with nature, dressed up in scientific and theological language. These uncertainties are real. They must be acknowledged. Intellectual honesty demands it. The traditions might be wrong. The science might be overinterpreted. The convergence might be coincidence. Plant consciousness might be a beautiful idea with no basis in reality. But consider the alternative. Consider that every major religious tradition, independently, across thousands of years, across every continent, described nature as conscious. Not one tradition. All of them. Not as a peripheral teaching, as a central claim. And now, science, using methods that have nothing to do with theology, nothing to do with prayer, nothing to do with spiritual practice, is discovering that plants process information, communicate, learn, remember, and use quantum mechanics. Either every tradition was wrong about the same thing, in the same way for thousands of years, and the scientific evidence is a coincidence, or they were perceiving something real, something that their methods could detect, and that Western science, with its materialist assumptions and its neuro-chauvinist biases, could not detect until it developed instruments sensitive enough to see what indigenous peoples and mystics and prophets saw with their unaided perception. The second possibility is more parsimonious, more elegant, more consistent with the data, and more humbling. Here is what this series has shown you. A leaf is a quantum computer, running algorithms that Google cannot replicate, converting sunlight to energy with near-perfect efficiency through quantum coherence, exploiting superposition, the same phenomenon that operates in particle accelerators at room temperature, in wet biological tissue, with a sophistication that 3 billion years of evolution have optimized beyond anything human engineering has achieved. A forest is a superorganism, connected by an underground fungal network older than brains, sharing resources based on need, warning neighbors of threats, recognizing kin, keeping the dead alive, making collective decisions through millions of distributed processing nodes, operating with an intelligence that satisfies every functional definition of the word. Consciousness might be fundamental, not a product of neurons, not an emergent property of sufficiently complex brains, a basic feature of reality, present in every cell, in every microtubule, in every quantum system, filtered and focused by biological structures into the specific forms of awareness that different organisms experience. And every tradition knew. Paul knew creation groans, the Quran knew trees prostrate, the Upanishads knew Brahman is in everything, Dogon knew mountains are awakened, the psalmist knew trees sing, the Aboriginal elder knew the land remembers, the Potawatomi grandmother knew plants are people. They knew because they were paying attention to the same reality we are now studying with lasers and spectrometers and isotope trackers. The same reality, different instruments, same conclusions. You walk past a tree today, or yesterday, or this week. You walk past trees constantly. You have done this your entire life. Thousands of trees, tens of thousands, and you have never once stopped to consider the possibility that the tree was aware of you passing, that it sensed the vibrations of your footsteps through its root system, that the chemical composition of your exhaled breath registered on its molecular sensors, that the shadow you cast as you walked past was detected by its photoreceptors and processed by a distributed network of millions of cellular nodes, that the information about your passing was transmitted through the fungal web to neighboring trees, that the forest noted your presence the way your neighborhood notes a stranger walking down the street. Quietly, collectively, without alarm but without indifference. You have been seen by trees your entire life, and you have never seen them back. Not really. Not as what they are. Not as quantum computing, network connected, information processing, chemically communicating, kin recognizing, community sustaining, possibly conscious beings that have been alive on this planet for 400 million years before you arrived. Jesus said, "Consider the lilies." The Quran said, "You do not understand their praising." The Upanishads said, "Brahman is in everything." The indigenous grandmothers said, "The plants are people." Perhaps it is time to listen, not to believe uncritically, not to abandon science for mysticism, but to allow the possibility that the oldest human intuition about nature, that it is alive, that it is aware, that it is participating in something that includes but transcends human consciousness, might be the most scientifically supported intuition we have ever had. The leaf broke physics, the root broke neuroscience, the forest broke ecology, the traditions broke the assumption that consciousness belongs to humans alone. What quantum biology discovered in 2007, that a leaf runs quantum computations, was the crack in the wall. What followed plant learning, plant memory, plant communication, plant cooperation, the wood wide web, the mother trees, the dying trees that give everything away, was the wall coming down. And what the traditions have been saying for 3,000 years was what was always on the other side of the wall. A living world, a conscious world, a world that praises in ways we do not understand. A world that groans under the weight of what we have done to it. A world that is waiting, as Paul said, for liberation. A world that might be more aware of us than we have ever been of it. And the tree outside your window is still there, still photosynthesizing with quantum coherence, still communicating through the fungal web, still sensing the world through 20 senses you did not know it had, still praising in a language you do not understand, but you are beginning to.